let's get started. I'd like to welcome everyone on the Zoom today. Those of you beaming in from Long Island like me, I'm here in my office in East Northport. Those of you in some other part of the country, as well as our remarkable speakers today. A word of thanks to those groups who made the webinar possible. The public employees for environmental responsibility, whose initiative got the ball rolling, Tim Whitehouse, to the Citizens Campaign for the Environment and Northeastern's PFAS Project Lab, who picked it up and ran with it, and as well as to my own Environmental Data and Governance Initiative, EDGI, for the bridge work done. My name is Chris Sellers, and I teach environmental history and other things environmental at Stony Brook University on Long Island. And I'm also a co-founder of EDGI. We're here today to talk about a set of environmental chemicals usually known by the shorthand word PFAS. That stands for pair and polyfluoroalkyl substances and includes dozens of chemicals that were manufactured and used in products after World War II because of their unusual stability. They are, as our webinar title puts it, forever chemicals. In recent decades, we've come to learn that many of them are also toxic. It turns out they slipped underneath the radar screen of the EPA and our environmental laws of the 1960s and 70s, even as Long Islanders played leading roles in the tackling of DDT and other of the environmental toxics that were known to that era. It thus feels entirely fitting, at least for me as an historian, that Long Island is now becoming recognized as a ground zero for the dangers from PFAS, even as today's federal government has been dragging its heels in confronting them. So we're starting out today with a couple of announcements. First of all, the questions are to be posed in the Q&A function on the bar below your screens. We've turned off the chat just to keep that whole discussion channeled. And second, we'd like to try this a poll of everyone here just at the outset to test, your knowledge about this. Is what we do as university professors all the time, to test your knowledge about PFAS or what your current awareness is. So I'll give you 60 seconds for everyone to complete the poll, and then we'll begin. All right, so our first speaker today, you can see the results. Our first speaker today is Phil Brown. He's a University Distinguished Professor of Sociology and Health Science at Northeastern University. He directs the Social Science Environmental Health Research Institute there and its PFAS lab, which has grants from NSF as well as the National Institute of Environmental Health Science to study various aspects of the PFAS issue, including social policy, activism, and community responses, and to develop a nationwide report back and information system for it. Phil, tell us about this problem of PFAS.
So we'll be talking about these chemicals as a class, and let's go to the next slide. This is a story about what are now the most talked about chemicals in our daily life. And there are over 9,000 of these compounds, and over half of those are actually in some kind of use. It's a crisis that's only recently gotten national attention, and a very incredible example of the public's environmental health literacy and activism. There's a really large change in the regulatory climate, especially at the state level, growth in science, and enormous amount of social science collaboration with environmental health science. Next slide. The work that we do in our lab started from a 2015 grant from NSF, where we were trying to find out why it took so long for science and society to understand what PFAS were and how extensive they were. And we developed this website, and it's updated pretty much every day, thousands of visitors, and it's, I think, the best place to find out what's going on. Next slide. The sources of the environment, at first, we mainly thought they were the industrial producers, such as DuPont, which was very famous for the first major discovery of contamination, but also other industries like Saint-Gobain that used PFAS to make other products. A little bit later on, there was a lot of attention to the firefighting foams that are important, of course, for you on island. And every time we turned around, there were new sources. So landfills and wastewater treatment plants and the sludge coming out of them, food packaging, food itself grown using sludge, and septic systems. Next slide. Food has really become gotten a lot of attention lately because of all the things that are raised on sludge and because of the food packaging and wrapping. And if you're not near an industrial site or a firefighting site, the odds are that a lot of your contamination personally is coming from food in some source. Next. Well, a lot of what we knew came from NHANES, which is the CDC's very important national biomonitoring study. And the data show that virtually every American has PFAS in their blood. Next slide. Some of these are very persistent. The older, more traditional long chain ones, as we call them, could stay in the body for years. The replacement chemicals stay in the body for shorter, and industry says, well, this is not a problem because they get out of your body quickly. But you'll also notice that BPA, which is not a PFAS, but another chemical that we all have a lot of attention to, only stays in the body, its half-life is 3 to 6 hours. We're concerned with BPA. We know it has a lot of health effects because we're ingesting it all the time. And because the PFAS are forever chemicals, they're around, we're ingesting them all the time. So shorter half-life does not mean that we're protected. Next. This class of compounds has a very long history. And DuPont first discovered Teflon way back in 1938 and began to use it in their Washington Works plant in 1951. Also in the 50s, 3M started selling Scotchgard, and in 1967, we started to see this in food packaging. Next. What's important is that industry knew for a long time that there were health effects, first with animals and then with humans. And this slide, like many others, I'm going to give you an excess of detail and not really talk about it all because you can use these later as reference material. But we have a lot of evidence that you see here that industry, especially DuPont and 3M, knew that there were dangers. They hid those dangers. They didn't tell people, and they had no way. We had no way of knowing what we were exposed to because of that. The resources at the bottom show you how you can find a lot of these in original documents. Next. One of the main sources of discovery here was the Tennant's farm next to DuPont. DuPont bought this. They dumped a lot of chemicals there from their plant, and all this waste wound up killing all of their cows, led to a suit, led to fines by EPA, which were small in the scheme of things, but the largest EPA fine to date. And importantly, a very large lawsuit payout that resulted in a very famous health study, which we'll see on the next slide. For 8 years, the C8 Health Panel studied over 69,000 people, the largest environmental epidemiology project ever to date, and found that these 6 diseases and conditions were caused by, probable cause was the term they used, by exposure to this one particular, most famous of the PFAS, PFOA. Next. This generated a lot of other interest and research, and scientists began to study and find many other health effects, as you see listed here, many reproductive and developmental effects, other cancers, a lot of adverse health outcomes. And the International Agency for Research on Cancer has said that PFOA is probably carcinogenic in humans. Next. Now, there's no regulation here. So while the Safe Drinking Water Act regulates 90 chemicals and biological toxics in water. It does not have any regulations for any of the PFAS, and it's got MCLs only for those 90. So in the absence of this, all we know from EPA is what they do every couple of years, the unregulated contaminant monitoring rule. They study medium to large water systems and find what they might later discuss as possible regulatory action. And what was important in the third round, UCMR3, is the first time they looked at PFAS, they found very extensive contamination. Next. And this is why we need the class-based approach, because the more you look, the more you find. It's basically looking under the lamppost at first, and then the light expands and you see lots more. And many scientists and government officials and ex-government officials are now saying, let's not just go after replacements, let's regulate these as a class. And you'll see in the next slide that the whack-a-mole approach doesn't work, because you see the other original legacy PFAS, PFAS, has gone down dramatically. But one of the replacements for it, PFNA, has risen in the same period of time just as rapidly. Next. Best example of this is the terrible substitution of Gen X for PFOA. And DuPont spun off a company called Chemours, divested themselves of financial and legal responsibility, and have contaminated about half of all of North Carolina from their one manufacturing plant of Gen X. Next. What's going on now, of course, is some useful federal action. There's a national health study by the CDC's Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. There are 7 sites. The first has already started in Pease, the others are underway. Pease we'll talk about later as a source of important activism. But the Omnibus Defense Act that's passed every year also has started to have a lot of parts in it, including stopping the use of firefighting foams. And EPA has announced that it will start to have regulatory levels, maximum contaminant levels, in the next couple of years for the 2 main chemicals. Next. This is just to show you that states have been picking up the slack. These are the states that have MCLs already. They're far lower than what the EPA's health advisory non-regulatory level is. Next slide, you'll see a host of other actions. These are not necessarily regulatory, but they're notification levels, they're advisory levels. But we see, again, many states taking up the action where the federal government has not. And again, at much lower levels than the federal advisory. Next. One of the things that's important is even when the state does their job and starts to regulate, as you see New Hampshire in January of 2019, put some fairly high levels on the 4 chemicals that they were going to look at and regulate. And then activists, as well as some scientists looking at data from Minnesota, said, no, that's much too high. And 6 months later, the actual promulgated MCLs were far lower, as you see here in the bottom row. Next. Some of the implications at present are that we see the states taking action. We see that a regulatory approach may be good, but more importantly, it may be that we can list these chemicals under the Superfund Act, CERCLA, because then we could declare many sites as Superfund sites, which we can't now since they aren't listed under the CERCLA. But the problem is a patchwork of state levels is really ineffective. So let's move on. Some of the most recent news you're seeing here, incredibly, even in a very conservative legislature like North Carolina, unanimous bill on banning AFFF, the firefighting foam. Evidence of widespread breast milk contamination, suits from local towns and cities, various attempts to pressure the chemical industry like Solvay to stop marketing their products. Next. Retailer and legislative actions as well. Companies being asked to stop using this in retail and wholesale production. Next. What we did was to put together a contamination site database. And in this database, we began with a handful of sites. It grew and grew. And next slide, you see the map we put together with the Environmental Working Group. that listed these. It's been widely used, as you see on the next slide, even by Senator Carper in a Senate hearing. And while we're not doing this anymore, we have a new map that you see on the next slide that will be live soon. And in the next slide, you see a close-up of your area. You see sites in New York. Next. I'm just going to leave you with this. There's so much to say about this, but these are the best sort of resources. If you wanted to find out more about this, go to these 4 locations, and you'll get all the up-to-date material on science, policy, and regulation. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil, for some great introductory information about this substance. I think we're going to move directly into the next speaker's talk. This is, I'll call your attention to the question and answer. Some of the questions have already been asked and answered that occurred to people during Phil's talk. I encourage you to put your questions there, both to Phil and to Adrienne, who is going next. Adrienne Esposito is going to be speaking about specifically Long Island, where some of these questions are directed. She is Executive Director of Citizens Campaign for the Environment, which is New York's largest environmental organization, over 140,000 members. She has over 35 years of experience in environmental protection work, including leading initiatives to protect drinking water, restore estuaries, clean up toxic waste, protect land, reduce pesticides, and upgrade water infrastructure, and more. Adrienne has been working a long time on Long Island, is going to tell us about PFAS there.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. So you might be saying, okay, I hear a lot about toxic chemicals, and how does that impact living on Long Island, land of the sole source aquifer? So let's go to the first slide. We're going to go to the first slide. Okay, maybe we're not. I'll just talk. So many of you know that on Long Island, we drink from a sole source aquifer. That means 100% of our drinking water comes from directly underneath our feet. What that means is that everything we do on the land impacts that drinking water source below us on the bottom. So that means when we use PFAS on the surface in those ways that Phil described, whether it's firefighting foam or other industrial contamination, it goes directly underneath the ground. There we are. I knew we would get it. Next one. Okay, so what goes underneath the ground? Things like the old firefighting foam and fireproofing on carpets and furniture. We also, unfortunately, used to be a world that loved PFAS, which would mean that we spray it on our cookware, our Teflon, because it prevented our eggs from sticking and our bacon from sticking. So, you know, let's just throw those toxic chemicals into the pot, literally and figuratively. And our clothes, we wanted our clothes to be waterproof, so spray it on there. Food packaging and plastics. There were some questions in the chat about that. You know, we are a country that was wrapping our burritos and our hamburgers and our French fries in toxic chemicals and then enjoying them. So what can be done? I do want you to know, and somebody asked this question earlier, does New York State test? Yes. As of last year, in August, New York State implemented and codified into law a new drinking water standard for both PFOA and PFOS at 10 parts per trillion. That means that all water suppliers across New York State are now mandated to do their routine testing for these chemicals. Also, very good news, after a battle, took 2 years, but we did ban PFAS from food wrappers in New York State, and that'll go into implementation next year. So 2 good things. So we're not only the bearers of bad news, we have a little good news for you as well. Next one. So do we have any instances of PFAS contamination on Long Island? Well, you're going to be sorry you asked. The answer is yes. Gabreski Airport is one of the more famous sites. Hampton Bays Fire Station, Firematics Training Center in Yaphank, which is actually a Superfund site. These are all Superfund sites. Most of them are, not all of them. East Hampton Airport, the Navy Grumman Plume in Carrollton, Brookhaven National Laboratory, Rowe Industries Groundwater in Sag Harbor. And the last one is not a Superfund site. We have to update this slide. MacArthur Airport, they actually found only one hit there of 70 parts per trillion. And as I said, the drinking water standard is 10, but that was a well that actually they already had activated granular treatment on it. So it was already being filtered and they haven't found anything since then. So that's a little bit more good news with that one. Next. Okay. Most of these were caused by the firefighting foam. And these are actual pictures. So I don't want you to think we made these up. The training centers in Yaphank, the fire station in Hampton Bays, Gabreski Airport, they used this foam for 30 years. And that explains how the foam would then seep down underground, continue to travel down into the aquifer system and contaminate the drinking water. You can see here at Gabreski, it was almost 60,000 parts per trillion. That's really high. Unfortunately, especially on the east end of Long Island, but not limited to the east end of Long Island, we have a lot of homes on private wells where they are not tested regularly, if at all. And when they were, because of the airport's activities, this is how the PFAS contamination has been found. Same is true for the Hampton Bays. Keep going. I just wanted to tell you this about, and you can see these too. These are actual photos. Some of these are we found these photos at Brookhaven Lab. The lab actually said to us, and I'm not picking on Brookhaven, this is an actual story. They did not know of any firefighting that went on there. They didn't know of any training that went on there. They were quite sure they didn't have PFAS. And then a local reporter found these old photos taken at the lab of firemen walking around in this firefighting foam, knee deep, thigh deep. And then the lab started testing and they found PFAS, believe it or not, in the groundwater. Keep going. Okay, one thing I just want to mention is the Navy Grumman plume. The Navy is not exactly what I would call a good neighbor. We found highest detection of PFAS, 98.5 in someone's private well. Another one at 81 in someone's private well. They've been drinking from the wells. We're in an active campaign right now, very aggressive, to get these 126 homes hooked up to the public water supply. We had 98 of those homes agreed to have their homes tested free of charge by the Suffolk County Health Department, which we deeply appreciate. 15% of them tested positive for PFAS. We're doing another action this weekend in order to work with our federal leaders to attain the $12.4 million it's going to cost to hook those homes up to the public water drinking system. Next. Okay, as we mentioned, there also, a little bit of good news is that we established a drinking water standard in New York State, not only for PFAS, but for its, we call its evil twin, 1,4-dioxane, which is at 1 part per billion. Unfortunately, though, this is the way it works in New York State. The health department has a process where if a water company cannot meet these new standards, they can apply for and receive what's called a deferral. That means they get an extra 2 years to meet the standards. In some cases, like 1,4-dioxane, it might be reasonable because the technology to treat 1,4-dioxane takes a little while to get it up and running. And it's not exactly an off-the-shelf model of technology. It's an advanced oxidation technology. But with PFAS, we have the technology to treat it. It is it's carbonated, active carbonated granular carbonation filters. And we really want and need our water suppliers to get up and running on this as soon as possible. In 2021, CC released a report and found that 24 applications were made from Long Island to get a deferral 21 of them were granted by the New York State Health Department. So we are now pushing for no more deferrals after this 2 years, and we believe that the public deserves clean water. Keep going. Okay, this is just a brief list of all the ones that requested and received a deferral notice. We also went through every single drinking water report to see what the highest level of PFAS was in each of these districts. And that report is on our website. So I know we're doing this quick right now, but please feel free to check our website for this report and for your district. Again, not all water districts. It was 21 of them on Long Island. Some of them barely had any, but some had considerable amounts. Keep going. I'm done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adrienne. Lots of information there and lots of questions. I wonder if you've sort of answered this, but I'm going to bring up Deirdre DeLay's question. She is asking from earlier in your talk, are the results of New York State testing of these chemical contaminations publicly available? If so, where can we find the data? You want to, I think you answered that partly, but it wouldn't hurt to just address that quickly again.
Is that for me or Phil?
That's for you, Adrienne.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Are the results of New York State testing publicly available? If yes, where can we find the data?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, they're absolutely available. Each water supplier across New York State is mandated by law to put out a water report, and it should be on their website. Actually, we know it is on their websites. They're very good about doing it. Those water reports delineate any and all contamination that was found, and it's for over 300 different chemicals. It's not just these PFAS and PFOA, but also for a myriad of other chemicals as well.
Okay, thank you. We have a number of other questions, both more general and more specific, that I'm going to delay until everyone has had, all the speakers have had a chance to present. We'll move along now to Kyla Bennett. Kyla is going to speak about PFAS and pesticides. She is Peer's Northeast and Mid-Atlantic Director and Director of Science Policy. She previously worked at EPA Region 1 as a wetland permit reviewer, and then as the region's wetlands enforcement coordinator. And she has a PhD in ecology and evolution, as well as a JD from Lewis and Clark Law School. Kyla?
Thank you so much, Chris. Oops, there we go. So today I'm going to be talking about PFAS in pesticides. And Peer started looking into whether pesticides contained PFAS last year. And the reason we did this is that in Massachusetts, we noticed that a lot of communities were finding PFAS in their drinking water, and there was no reason for them to have it in there. There was no industry or fire training facility or anything like that. And the only thing that these towns had in common was the fact that they were bombarded with aerial spray for mosquitoes almost on a yearly basis to combat EEE, Eastern equine encephalitis, which is we're ground zero for that particular disease. It's very rare, but very fatal if you do get it. So I asked the Department of Environmental Protection here whether there was PFAS in Anvil 1010, which is the pesticide that's used for aerial spraying. It's also used in New York. They told me no. They asked EPA. EPA said no. We didn't trust them, so we tested. And not to our surprise, but to our dismay, we found that indeed Anvil 1010 had both PFOA and Gen X. Next slide, please. So far, we have found PFAS in 7 different pesticides. We've tested a number of them. Anvil 1010, Maverick, Perimeter, which is also a flea and tick and mosquito type of pesticide. Permanone, which is also for mosquitoes. 2 herbicides, which are sold over the counter, so homeowners can be spreading these on their lawns. And we just recently found them in pet products. Next slide, please. So what levels are we seeing? As Phil and Adrienne mentioned, there are limits. There are no federal limits. The EPA has issued a lifetime health advisory of 70 parts per trillion for 2 of the 9,252 PFAS, for PFOA and PFOS. So we know that PFAS are measured in parts per trillion because they're that toxic. Dr. Linda Birnbaum, who is the former director of the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences, was unable to say, she was stopped from saying when she was working for the federal government, that the safety threshold for just one of these 9,252, PFOA, in drinking water should be 0.1 parts per trillion. We are finding levels of between 250 parts per trillion to 2,000 and more parts per trillion in these pesticides. And we're finding a variety of different PFAS. One of the issues is there are so many of them. Commercial labs right now can only test for about 70. So there's not even a way for us to be able to figure out what the real contamination levels are because we simply cannot test for these chemicals. Next slide, please. So how does PFAS get into pesticides? There are a number of possible ways. Contamination from the manufacturing process. If the machinery used to create these pesticides once contained PFAS, this stuff is very sticky. And even if you wash these machines out over and over, you're still going to have remnant contamination. It could be contamination from the containers. And indeed, when we found PFAS in Anvil 1010, EPA confirmed our results, and they decided that the PFAS was coming from the fluorinated HDPE containers holding the pesticide Anvil 1010. And they found levels in the parts per billion, not parts per trillion, both on the inside and the outside of these barrels, and it was leaching into the pesticide. PFAS can also be deliberately added as inert ingredients, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, or also deliberately added as active ingredients. Next slide, please. So PFAS in inert ingredients. This is just a screenshot, a partial screenshot of EPA's list of approved inert ingredients in pesticides. And there were 19 of them on there. I just searched for fluoroalkyl and found 19, 17 of which are PFAS. Now, EPA says that these are not actually used as inert ingredients in pesticides, but they are on the approved list. My question back to them was, well, if they're not used, why are they on here? We should get them off. We do know that some pesticides have PFAS in the inert ingredients. Next slide, please. Why would they be added deliberately? PFAS make great surfactants, so when they're sprayed, it can make it spread evenly over vegetation, for example. Great dispersants, they're anti-foaming agents. They can even increase the shelf life of a pesticide or increase the potency and the duration of the pesticide, how long it lasts. Next slide. So PFAS as an active ingredient. Both the industry, the pesticide industry, and EPA says that there are not any PFAS as active ingredients in pesticides. This is not true. The addition of fluorine does add to pesticide potency and increases the duration of effect. And I've just listed 7 here that we found just glancing at the list of registered pesticides. These are all PFAS. These are all on EPA's master list of PFAS. Next slide, please. So what is New York doing? After the Anvil information got released to the public, on January 15th, the DEC commissioner in New York directed his staff to take a hard look at the science. He quarantined Anvil 1010 products statewide, which was great. And he launched an investigation into what else were in these containers, these fluorinated HDPE containers, because they are used for other pesticide products and even food products, which is more concerning. So New York is taking some good steps, but the problem is it's not just Anvil 1010. Next step, please. Next slide, please. What's EPA's position? EPA said that everybody, all states, should discontinue the use and hold Anvil 1010. They also said, and this is very interesting, that any level of PFAS in pesticides, they might consider to be potentially toxicologically significant, which triggers a provision of FIFRA, the Federal Pesticide Act, which would require registrants of pesticides to report what they call impurities. But there's a lot we don't know about this. Are they going to force manufacturers to test all the pesticide products, which they should, because PEER is getting tired of testing them for them? And what then? Will they be taken off the market if they are found to contain PFAS? Next slide, please. So where do we go from here? Tim, the next speaker, is going to be talking a lot about that, but I just wanted to mention two things. First of all, EPA does not define PFAS. They just simply don't have a definition anywhere on their website. And the United Nations Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, does have a very good definition of PFAS, which is any compound containing at least one fluorinated carbon. EPA could start with that. And one last thing I want to mention is one way that we should be pressing EPA to regulate this stuff is there's a new approach called the P-sufficient approach, or persistence sufficient approach. EPA will regulate chemicals that are persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic. And what we think is that PFAS are so persistent, and we haven't found one yet that's not toxic, as Phil showed in his presentation at the beginning. So we should be regulating them all solely because they are so persistent in the environment and we have no way to destroy them. So one of the sources of Long Island's PFAS problem is from the pesticides that are sprayed and used by homeowners. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyla. One question for you. I think it may have been answered in part by Adrienne. But is there a problem with PFAS in fertilizers at all, or is it more confined to pesticides, or do we?
It's in fertilizers too, as Adrienne, and I think Phil mentioned as well. It's in biosolids, which is sold as fertilizer. So when you take wastewater treatment plant effluent and they dry it, and then they sell that as fertilizer, that is chock full of PFAS. It's got tens of thousands of parts per trillion. And when you put it on your gardens or your lawn or whatever, it can both get into the groundwater and it can also be taken up by food. So into the plants themselves, which is another good reason to buy organic, because organic farms are not allowed to use biosolids.
Okay, thank you for that. Our final speaker to wrap us up today is Tim Whitehouse. He's the executive director of the PEER. This is, if those of you not familiar with it, it supports current and former public employees who seek a higher standard of environmental ethics and scientific integrity within their agencies. He himself has worked for the EPA as senior attorney and was head of the Law and Policy Program at the North American Commission for Environmental Cooperation up in Montreal. He's going to be speaking with us today about what the EPA can do on this problem area.
Thank you, Chris. While my slides are getting prepared, I wanted to emphasize that what Phil Brown said about their PFAS lab website. It's a wonderful website that we rely on tremendously, and also reiterate what Adrienne said about the information they have on their website. So this information will be posted on the YouTube presentation, and we, as investigators of this issue, often rely on websites like CCE and the PFAS Project Lab. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about basically the issue sort of I want to leave people with is US EPA needs to change. There needs to be radical change at EPA. The federal government is still falling short in the actions it needs to take. And unfortunately, this has put the burden on local communities in Long Island and elsewhere to spend a great deal of money fixing a problem that was solved, that was created by very wealthy chemical companies and overlooked by EPA. Next slide. So US EPA needs to change. Over the years, it's been captured by the chemical industry. We hope this administration can bring about a culture change and some change in mid-level management at EPA. A lot of the problems that exist at EPA have been caused over the years in both Democratic and Republican administrations, where mid-level management is too willing to bend to the needs of the chemical industry and overlook the public's input. There's been a tremendous rush to get new chemicals onto the market, and that also needs to change. If we look at this, we're talking about how local communities are spending millions and millions of dollars to fix these problems. NGOs like PEER are testing pesticides. We're a very small organization. Groups like the Environmental Working Group are also testing extensively. And this really should be a federal function, and it should be supported by those with the money that created the problem, the chemical industry. Next slide. So the federal government under the Biden administration has promised to take significant action on PFAS. That is a great thing. The Trump administration also promised and did not come through on those promises. One of the reasons why the federal government is starting to react is because of the groundswelling of concern by local communities, and also by the bipartisan nature of the problem. This is one of the few environmental issues where there are many Republicans that support federal action to address PFAS. The administration has set up a new council to address PFAS. They've closed a loophole for low volume exemptions for PFAS, which allowed users of PFAS to skip all regulatory review if they had low volume usage. They've announced national drinking water standards coming down the line for PFOS and I should have said PFOA and PFAS, certain PFAS, not the 9,000. So there's still a long way to go. And they're going to begin collecting data for 29 PFAS in drinking water. And in Congress, there's the Congress PFAS Action Act of 2021. That's the most far-reaching act we've seen out of Congress, but it still does not go far enough, and I'll address some of the reasons why in the next slide. So in order to protect human health and the environment from PFAS, there needs to be a definition of what PFAS is. One of the things Kyla mentioned is when we talk to the pesticide office about PFAS, they say they define it differently than the toxics part of EPA and the COMTOX database. So within EPA, they don't have a single definition. And so some offices say, well, there's no PFAS in that, and then they use a different definition than what is commonly understood to be PFAS. So legislation needs to define PFAS in the way the OECD does, the international organization. There's a tremendous amount of information that EPA has on PFAS in the environment. We spent almost a year through the Freedom of Information Act fighting to get that information. And I think I'll send it to you, Phil, so you can put it on your website. We finally did get it, but EPA has not been transparent about what it's finding nationally in terms of PFAS contamination, and that needs to change. There needs to be prevention, prevent the introduction of new PFAS and new uses of PFAS. We need to regulate PFAS as a class. I think both Phil, Adrienne, and Kyla mentioned this. There are over 9,000 PFAS. There's no way that EPA can evaluate each one of those PFAS. And they have enough similar characteristics that they should be regulated in one cohesive way as a class. Europe is moving toward allowing only essential uses for PFAS. The United States should follow suit. And there needs to be surface water discharge, drinking water, and air emission standards. These are all ways that PFAS end up either in the environment and eventually into human beings. And then the last thing is to regulate PFAS under federal laws. CERCLA is a law for cleanup, and it does allow for drinking water standards to be built in. In RCRA, we don't hear much about RCRA, but RCRA is a federal law for management and disposal of PFAS. And one thing they're finding out about PFAS is we don't know how to dispose of it. If we put it in a landfill, it'll leach into the water. If we put it in an incinerator, it'll go up a smokestack. So EPA needs to develop disposal standards that are safe and prevent the disbursement of PFAS from one discharge to another source of contamination for humans. Next slide. Action items. I think let elected officials know about this issue, know you care about it. It's been really both devastating to see the effects this is having throughout the United States on different communities, and heartwarming to know that many local officials do care, and they are trying to respond to their constituents' needs. Support your local organizations like CCE that are very active in pressuring local and state officials to act, and national organizations that are fighting to change the system that favors the chemical interests over public health and the environment. And finally, vote. Let people know that you care about the environment and you care about PFAS. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. That was great as a sort of a look to what we can hope for going forward. Well, now we have a lot of questions that have been answered in the Q&A. I'd like to leap on to our general question session. And I'm going to start by going back to a question that was actually for Phil, hopefully still on here. What is your recommendation, Phil, for the safe disposal of AFFF that is being taken back from firefighters and military installations?
Well, at least here in Massachusetts, where we've been, I think, pretty much ahead of the game, the State Environmental Agency, the DEP, has provided a program for take back from fire training sites and firehouses and airports. The problem is that a lot of the way that we get rid of it is by incinerating it, and that's a problem. So it's very different from the question of what do you do to make sure you get clean drinking water, where you can use carbon and other kinds of filtration systems. But once you've got a bunch of foam out there and you're trying to dispose of it, it's a problem. We need a lot more research on how to do this, because these do not break down very easily. There's a new method that they've done some bench tests on in Australia, where they use very high temperature to put it into concrete. And that really keeps it from getting in the environment the way it would if it was burned in the incinerator. So yeah, we need more state agencies to do take back campaigns, because individual firehouses and fire training sites don't necessarily have the wherewithal to deal with this.
And I just want to chime in too. It's a great question by Patricia, because, that's why we call them forever chemicals, because they're so hard to get rid of. And even New York has a take back program also for all the firefighting houses that have foam left over in storage. And in New York and upstate, they were sending it to an incinerator. There was a big question about, but what is in the air emissions? So I know, for instance, we met, CC met with Covanter, and they were going to do some stack testing. So they stopped burning it, is my understanding, at my last meeting, which was only a couple of months ago. And they're going to do some small scale testing so they can get more real life data to answer that question. So, I think it's a great question, because it illustrates that prevention is much easier than cleaning it up afterwards. But in this case, we didn't know. We didn't know that firefighting foam had this chemical. And so the solution and the remedy is not going to be that easy.
Can I add something to that, which is, we can't destroy this stuff. EPA has what they call a challenge out there. They're going to pay $50,000 to anybody who can come up with a way to destroy PFAS. That carbon-fluorine bond is so strong. It's one of the strongest bonds that we know in chemistry. And it can't be incinerated because it ends up in the air. You can't put it in a landfill because it ends up in the leachate and then in the water. So there's really not a lot you can do with it. And right now, what EPA is talking about is just storing it. But some of these facilities generate, so I think I read somewhere 8 tractor trailer trucks full of PFAS waste a day. Where are you going to store all that stuff? So the answer is not, we do have to figure out how to destroy it and to filter it out. But even when you filter it out, your filters then become hazardous waste. You can't just put those in the landfill or incinerate them. So what we really need to do is turn off the tap. We have to ban all non-essential uses of this stuff.
So Kyla, we can't just put it in Yucca Mountain? That was a joke. No one sent emails about it. Sorry.
That's kind of the definition of what they call a wicked problem.
Yeah.
Well, we have one other question that is more general. This is from John Sexton. It pertains to the aquifer and the sole source aquifer that Nassau and Suffolk counties have. How do we get the government to treat this sole source aquifer as like they treat endangered species? Endangered species are protected in the geographic area they are found without reference to borders of states, counties, governmental districts. Right now, each water district decides what level of availment, how much, what level of development, how much water will be withdrawn. We need a common solution so that water districts don't do harm to other water districts. So I throw that out to anyone who wants to tackle it.
Well, I'll just start. Yes, John, that is a really good question. You know, look, that's another serious issue on Long Island, is that we have no overall water quality nor quantity management plan. Literally, it's like the Wild West of water. And people and the water districts don't, and the planning process don't take into consideration water quantity. Some of them pretend to, but they really don't. So we do have, you know, this is not on the topic of PFAS, but it is on the topic of sustainability. You know, when you live on an island with 3 million people, you have to think about how sustainable is that sole source aquifer and the underground drinking water supply. And we do not on this island, nor does the EPA provide enough guidance or provide actually anything to help us do that. So it is something that is at least on the radar. We've worked really hard to protect the aquifer. Land preservation is a key thing. We've passed multiple expensive, but definitely wise land preservation bond acts in both Suffolk and Nassau County and throughout the state. And that has helped us considerably with extending the life of, and the quality and quantity of the water in the aquifer system. But your question's a good one. There is not a good answer, and that's the reality of it.
I just stated very quickly that one of the problems, you know, with federal lack of regulations, the states had to pick it up. But also what we see is like a lot of municipalities do too. So in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, Hyannis was identified as a major foam contamination site, and the town government very quickly took action and, you know, went to meet the 70 parts per trillion health advisory. You don't have that in all cities and towns, but there are resources for those cities and towns to get information through, especially groups like the Northeast Waste Management Officers Officials Association, NUMOA, and then there's also the Interstate Technology and Regulatory Council, Environmental Council of the state. So there are resources out there where municipalities and states are sharing information together.
Chris, I actually, I tried to answer one of Mindy's questions and I accidentally hit the live answer instead of type. So her question was, is the Navy providing bottled water for the residents on Long Island who have above the PFAS? And the answer is no. Not only is the Navy for the Carrollton plume not providing bottled water, they're denying any responsibility at all. It's been immensely frustrating, and we have been working with Senator Schumer, Senator Gillibrand, and Congressman Zeldin's office to either have the Navy pay or to just get a federal grant for these people. The Water Authority in Suffolk County did an estimate of $12.5 million to connect folks. So we are using that as the basis for our financial need.
Sounds good.
Not if you live there.
Yeah. Well, yes, that's true. Well, okay. So here's a general question for all of you, and I think some of you have already begun to suggest answers. But what can people attending this webinar do next, more immediately, to begin to address this problem? What are the avenues? I mean, I know Tim has talked about this. Some others of you have mentioned some possible avenues, but I think it's a good way of thinking about a sort of a take-home message to consider what are the avenues available to those of us who are at this webinar on Long Island as well as beyond.
I would say adding to what I said is I think individuals can really cut down on the use of packaging and plastics. Many of these have PFAS in them. Our society is built around this easy disposable packaging. And so there are things that individuals can do in terms of their behavior as consumers, but ultimately it's a political question that requires advocacy, in my opinion.
Also, as I mentioned from the outset, the residents' activism around PFAS has been incredible. And I think that you can look to groups like the ones you see here, but also, you know, on a national basis, there's the National PFAS Contamination Coalition. If you go to one of the resources I mentioned, the PFAS Exchange, we have a map that shows you where activist groups are in every state. For people who don't yet have their own group, these are organizations that can help them do it, help them form. And all these groups, along with scientists and local officials, have been pushing states and doing so much, not just regulation, but, you know, issues around essential uses, around food packaging, around getting money promulgated to do testing and to help towns and cities do remediation work. It's an enormous amount of work that's going on, and the citizens groups are really leading it. So if you are not part of one of these groups yet, you know, connect with the existing ones. They can really help you do this.
And I'll just give you three things to end our forum today. One is, in addition to the local activist group, Citizens Campaign for the Environment, we work with NRDC, we work with Earth Justice. Those are some great groups in New York that are doing some great work on PFAS. Number two is that what you can do, as was said, cut down on your plastic, please. We don't need all this plastic waste. Number three is if you must fertilize, use an organic fertilizer. And number four is stop using pesticides. You know, every year we wait for spring, we love spring, we herald in spring, and then, you know, back come the robins, back come the hummingbirds, and then we poison our yards with pesticides and we kill them. Okay, we need to stop doing that. It's just, it's a remnant from an archaic time when we thought poisoning the earth was acceptable. Now we know better. So we can take our own actions as members of the public, but then also join forces with these groups, including CCE, that are, you know, kind of on the front line. And I think you guys at PEER are doing a great job. Phil, I loved your presentation. Chris, your work at the university is critical and important. And I think we, you know, it is, and it's making a difference. So to leave on a positive note, actually all the work of the last couple of years is making a difference. We do have a new EPA. We have a new EPA administrator. So all the things that Kyla was talking about, you know, we're going to double our efforts this year.
Very nice. Okay, well, I think there is one final question I hope we can attend to afterwards is how do people contact the speakers? If we can find some way of sending people emails and so on, that would be great. But I want to thank all our speakers, first of all, and, you know, if we were in person, we would of course applaud. But I also want to thank the participants, people who showed up, listened, and asked questions. Lots of good questions are answered in the chat. And I hope you guys can check these out as well. Perhaps we can make a way to have those answers be available online. Thanks for attending. Thanks for speaking, you all. And I look forward to some more progress on this wicked problem of PFAS.
Yep. Thank you, everyone. Thanks
Thank you,
for joining.
everyone.